Welcome back to Higher Exchanges. I'm your host, Jesse Redmond, Head of Investor Relations and Business Development at Leaf Brands. I'm joined this week and every week by Morgan Paxia. He is the co-founder of Poseidon. Morgan, what's going on, my friend?
Another day in lovely San Diego.
How are
So
things
doing well.
here? How are things there? It's overcast and a bit cool in the greater Santa Barbara area.
Today, we had the morning fogs burning off now. It's going to be a beautiful day. I know we got some weather coming this weekend, but I'll be at Berkshire, so I don't really care.
Oh, nice. That's in Omaha?
Yeah, fly out
For
tomorrow.
first one or no?
Yeah, this is my first one. Long time listener, first time caller. Can't wait. This is a bucket list item for me, so super pumped about going to it, especially this year with everything going on.
Is that a 2-day affair?
It's just one day, but getting to and from Omaha is not the easiest. So fly out tomorrow and be back Sunday.
Oh, cool. We'll look forward to getting a report on that next week. But Morgan, you and I are not alone today. We are joined by one of our favorites. His name is Hirsh Jain. Hirsh is knowledgeable, passionate, and a classy professional. He is one of the best written and verbal communicators in the business. Hirsch is a guy that you ask to do a bit of show prep, and he sends out a tremendous outline within 24 hours. So, Hirsch, great to have you on the show. Great to work with you. Welcome back to Higher Exchanges. And today I will say to you, Guten Tag.
It's one of the German words I know.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about where you are. You're live from Germany.
Yeah, I'm in Berlin, and it's incredible. It's an amazing city, as I think a lot of people know. It is a beautiful 75-degree day here in Berlin, which I'm told is very rare for late April, early May. Today is also May's Day in Berlin, May 1st, which is, I've learned, the International Labor Day. And so all across the city today, huge demonstrations like related to labor. And there's also a huge number of parties going on. It's like half Burning Man, half Occupy Wall Street. So there's a lot of activity on the streets, and I'm here at the ICBC cannabis conference that just wrapped up, which we'll talk about and which experience. So
yeah, tell us. So what's the vibe sesh in Berlin in general? Just kind of curious what it's like there. I mean, it sounds like it's a fun time being May's Day, but what's the vibes of the from ICBC? What's cooking there?
totally much to unpack about Germany, but just at a high level, I mean, it's awesome to be here. I feel like the same sense of excitement that I felt like early on during the early days in California during 2016, 2017. A lot of that excitement in different parts of the US, as we'll talk about, today, has sort of given way. So it's really exciting to be at the cusp of a market just taking off. And it's also amazing to build further community, meeting all of these incredibly talented professionals from different countries who are just as passionate about cannabis as we are. And so, in addition to learning a ton about the German market that I'm sure we'll unpack today, there was that excitement. There was the opportunity to meet all these cool people from France, from the UK, who are all descending on Germany and want to make their mark here. And the other thing is these conferences give you the opportunity to build stronger relationships with Americans that you already know. That's one thing I found, right? You may know someone, and when you see them at an American conference, you'll chat with them a little bit. But when you're abroad, there's solidarity in the fact that you're both Americans. And so there are dozens of people who I feel like I really built a much deeper relationship with over the course of these 3 days. So honestly, it's been amazing, and I feel so lucky to be here kind of at this moment in history.
Is the how much of it is domestic participation versus international, as you mentioned, like France, UK, America, I'm assuming Canada too, but what was kind of like the participation breakdown?
Totally. If I had to estimate, I think there are about 3,000 attendees, right, in total. So a fairly sizable conference. And I don't know the exact stats, but if I had to sort of ballpark it, I would say a narrow majority of people are Germans, right? And certainly a lot of the people on stage, were operators leading German cannabis companies, whether it be Cannasativa or 420 Pharma, et cetera. So I'd say a slight majority of folks are Germans, but just as you said, Morgan, right, there's great representation from other, European countries that are interested in exporting to Germany. We saw a great presence from a lot of, Canadian cannabis operators, folks that we had known before. And I would say there were, maybe several dozen Americans here. I don't know, maybe close to 100 or so. And a lot of those folks, are of a very high quality, people who are leading, attorneys, right, in the space, or other analysts in the space. So really, the most international cannabis gathering, at least I've ever been to, which has been super.
How do you know what the how big ICBC was last year? Like, is there like a notable growth to get to 3,000 or?
I do know that it's growing every year, right? So I was told that the first ICBCs actually were held in the United States, interestingly enough, in 2017, 2018. And, it's sort of like the MJ Biz story, right? Like initially we held this conference and there was 30 people in this broke hotel, right? And so I don't know the exact number for last year. My
Mhm.
is that every year it gets a little bit bigger. And obviously, I think the driving interest in being here this year is just the growth that we've seen in the medical cannabis market in Germany over the past 13 months has been astonishing. So if I had to ballpark it, maybe you had a couple thousand people there last year and 3,000 this year. And just the sense of excitement that people have is really, really palpable.
So you mentioned operators attending, some service professionals, call it, attending. Did you meet any investors?
Yes, I did meet some, none that I had, not like the US investors that I was familiar with previously, but I did encounter, a number of new investors here who are sort of intent on the thesis that this is a place that is worthy of attention, especially as the United States, sort of stagnates. So yeah, definitely met some new folks here as well.
And I'm just generally curious about the investor base globally. So were they more domestic, or are they from like Europe, or where were these folks coming in from?
Yeah, they were coming in from Europe. Some of them had sort of like a pharmaceutical kind of background, and so yeah, not many of the familiar faces, right? That you might see in the U.S. from an investor perspective, but yeah, these were folks from the U.K. or from the European continent.
Got it.
Do they feel as burnt out as we do over here? Like I find, Hirsch, when I go to different markets, I get different vibes where we're all from California and there's kind of a worn out vibe here where, we've had a lot of price compression. We have crazy regulations, and California's a pretty challenging market. So when I talk to a lot of people here, I get kind of that exhausted feeling. Whereas when I go to other states that are just kicking off or have newer adult use programs, they feel more invigorated. What sense did you get in Germany in terms of the overall excitement level?
I mean, I think people here are invigorated, right? I mean, there are some people who have encountered, right, a lot of the challenges in the US. And so surely they're exhausted with that. But I think part of their motivation in coming to Germany was to explore a new frontier where there's new possibilities. So yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of optimism and enthusiasm, while still, with a real-eyed recognition that, there will still be changes in this space, right? I don't think everyone was looking at things through rose-colored glasses. But yeah, I think people are excited to be here. And to kind of go back to your question, Morgan, about US investors, now that I think about it, right? Like one of the women that, I spent a lot of time with the past few days was Jean Sullivan, right? Who started ArcView. And there's an example of someone, right, who early in the US space and, has done a lot of great things, but has been doing this, as you have, Morgan, for more than a decade. So has a lot of bruises. And her constant refrain, right, throughout these few days was, this feels like 2013, 2014 all over again. And so what I took that to mean is like, okay, like, there has been a lot of what we experienced in the United States, but this reminds me of the enthusiasm that we felt when we were embarking on this journey in the US. And I should also say that enthusiasm was coupled with a lot of discourse about how has the United States evolved? What mistakes has the United States made? In what way can Germany rewrite the landscape as it pertains to cannabis and sort of allow that to flourish across the EU? So even people with scars seem to want to understand how they could avoid some of those same challenges in the future. And I thought that was, exciting to be part of that conversation.
What would you say were some of the big themes that people were talking about, of like, I mean, to that point of what are they doing different in Germany that they've learned from the US? And, I'm just curious because we looked at a lot of German deals, but to your point, the enthusiasm made a lot of these deals just uninvestable. They were, to your point, because they were like, it felt like 2014, 15, where, valuations versus reality were just, the bid ask spread was just unrealistic. So just kind of curious what they are learning and doing differently, and how that's translating to the the actual market.
Yeah, what was fascinating to me is that many of the folks, particularly the Germans, right, they were describing the regime as kind of a response to the way the US had rolled out its program, right? So one of the themes that we constantly heard was that, and we all know this to be true, that the US has adopted a highly fragmented approach, right, with varied rules across all of these jurisdictions. And that has made it very complicated for different operators. There was the refrain that the US taxed its industry and so contributed to like a really persistent illicit market. There was the theme that in the United States, a bunch of investor capital was lit on fire and they would like to shepherd their program in a more responsible way. You even heard the theme, from a number of the leading German cannabis operators, of operators like Canna Sativa or Grünhorn or 420 Pharma. Again, I know these names may be a little bit less familiar to a US audience, but these are some of the larger German players. They were talking about how they had engaged in a lot of their lobbying efforts in unison and were drawing a contrast between the lobbying approaches of multi-state operators and what they described as their kind of co-opetition model, where they recognized that in order for the market to be sustainable, they would have to work together. So I thought it was very interesting to think about how Germany was conceptualizing its own program in a very different way than the United States. And maybe one or two more things I'll mention quickly. These things are kind of obvious. There was a much stronger public health orientation in these conversations, right? If you think about in the United States, when we have policy debates around cannabis, it's often, my state is losing out on tax revenue to a neighboring state, right? Or we could create this number of jobs by legalizing cannabis. I was intrigued by the extent to which that wasn't really, and I was talking to actually Anthony Cogniglio of New Lake Capital about this, who actually made his point. So I'm actually just kind of stealing his point here. But he was making the point that whereas that animates the conversations in the United States, there's a much stronger public health orientation, right, in Germany that seeks to sort of focus on harm reduction and mitigate the illicit market. And I thought that was quite striking. It says a lot about the different ways in which these two regions are approaching cannabis. And last thing I'll say is this is a much more of a pharmaceutical, industry, and is much more about cannabis, at least in Germany, within an existing medical distribution system, being pharmacies, as opposed to standing up, right, a whole distinct kind of infrastructure to distribute cannabis. So there's more I could say there, but those are kind of the high level distinctions.
Sure. Do you, and just a follow up on the, the evolution of the landscape up to this point, there's been a pretty significant export market, right, from Canada to Germany to provide, wholesale product. Is there a sense of a domestic market wanting to compete with that, or how does Germany feel about that? Do they want more of like, not to like throw shade on the US, but I mean, we are inherently a state by state, and some of our states are, like take California, it's the fourth largest economy in the world, so it's just surpassed Japan. So I mean, we kind of can stand alone in some of these states, and there's a bit of protectionism around that as discussions go forward around interstate commerce. But how does it look like there? Do they have demand or interest in wanting to build more of their own capacity, or are they pretty happy with importing product from abroad?
Totally, it's a good question. One of the stats heard, this weekend is that 62% of the cannabis that is currently consumed in Germany is being imported from Canada. So to your point, Morgan, that's really a substantial amount. And I have to say, I didn't hear like big calls to develop like a domestic cultivation infrastructure and to sort of take ownership over at all, right? And so there seemed to be some level of satisfaction with the fact that German consumers could avail themselves of this product from other markets, and I didn't feel this kind of protectionist impulse. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before, that the animating goals of the German cannabis regime are not maybe to monopolize the economics for themselves, but to develop an industry that serves those public health goals. Now, you will hear, some claims to the contrary, right? There are operators like Demican, for example, a German operator, holds a domestic cultivation license. And one of its arguments is that by virtue of holding that license, it is valuable because it ultimately seek to prioritize its domestic cultivators. So yeah, there are people that are saying the ability to cultivate domestically within Germany is a valuable asset. But I didn't I didn't hear so much about that over the past few days. What I heard about is how can we broaden our set of, sort of product offerings so we could better compete with the market, for example. And those were sort of the focuses of the conversation.
Yeah, Guap there chiming in on the live stream saying electricity costs are 3 to 4x higher in Germany, and indoor grows are so insanely inefficient and expensive in the first place. That's an interesting data point there as well, which may be why they're leaning into more of the imports.
Totally.
Right.
And
Yeah,
the
it's
other
why.
thing,
Go ahead, Ben.
yeah, just Morgan, to your point, I heard much more enthusiasm about the development of an international supply chain, right? There was a lot of discussion about, like Bob Hoban, for example, a very prominent attorney in the United States that you guys may know of and does a lot of international. He was leading a lot of conversations about how the development of an international supply chain for cannabis can help obscure some of the deficiencies in different domestic programs, right? And we already kind of intuitively understand this to be true, right? In the United States, we say, hey, if we could engage in interstate commerce, then these like siloed states like Oregon and California, that are really struggling right now, they might be able to benefit from these national markets. And so similarly, you heard a lot of conversation about how an international supply chain, could benefit both countries because Canada has a surplus of product, and now it could provide that high quality product to a domestic market in which that was in great demand. So you heard a lot about how an international supply chain can benefit kind of both parties, and a lot about the legitimating effect of an international supply chain, right? Once this becomes a global industry, then a lot of domestic kind of concerns and stigma about cannabis is sort of mitigated a little bit because there's a legitimizing effect when it becomes a global commodity. And maybe last thing I'll say, because you mentioned the US, Morgan, amongst the Americans, there was a lot of discussion about how, and you're seeing a lot of great journalists like Javier Haas from Benzinga write about this, about how this can motivate, the increasing international commerce around cannabis can motivate the United States to get beyond its like very childish bickering over cannabis and ultimately become a global player. And so I guess the takeaway there is the development of that international infrastructure was viewed as a positive thing in almost all of the conversations I was a part of, as opposed to something that like my domestic economics. And that was really exciting to me.
And Hirsch, where are they in terms of form factors out there? So in the U.S., what we're broadly seeing is flower. I guess we call it whole flower, raw flower, whatever you just buy a jar or bag of flour, put it in a pipe, put it in a bong, roll a joint. That continues to get smaller and smaller. And it's the manufactured, easier form factors that are getting more popular. Your vapes, your edibles, even in the flower category, a lot of that is shifting over to pre-rolls. Are you seeing that in Germany where the other kind of pushing the easy button type form factors are popular, or is flower still a big driver over there?
Flower is still a big driver. And I should admit, I'm not an expert on the German market. We were learning about the form factors and the very complicated regulations that allow for certain kinds of extracts. And yet, vapes are still prohibited. And it seems like there's a lot of creative legal interpretation of what's being allowed, and it's evolving in real time. But I think the quick and dirty answer to your question, Jesse, is form factors are still quite limited. Flower is the predominant form factor. There are some kind of concentrate products. There was one operator who mentioned, I think it was 420 Pharma, that they were about to come out with the first vape pen, right, sometime soon. And so there continue to be limited form factors. I imagine that'll evolve over time. When it came to discussions of the illicit market, it's really funny. In the United States, we often view the illicit market as being buttressed by the price disparity, right? The fact that it's a lot cheaper to buy illegal weed than it is to buy legal cannabis. But in Germany, actually, right, by using their existing medical infrastructure, legal cannabis is actually cheaper than illicit, right? So legal cannabis, the estimates that we were given, is being sold through those pharmacy channels for 4 to 7 euros a gram, whereas illicit cannabis, right, is selling for 10 euros a gram. And so I mention that because a lot of the discussion around mitigating the illicit market was not so much, hey, we need to make legal cannabis cheaper so people buy it legally, right, which is kind of the constant in our conversation. In the US, it was, hey, we just adopted this decrim model, and yet through legal channels, we're only able to offer, a small amount of product. And so if we want to combat the illicit market, we have to develop form factors that are competitive with the illicit products that are now not penalized given the state of decrim that exists here. And an anecdote that I kept hearing throughout my few days here was about Mary Jane, which is an event I've never been to, but I think is held in June of each year. And apparently there was a lot of illicit California sales, California brands being sold at this Mary Jane event in Berlin last June. And I was told that that was anticipated to continue when it happens this June. And so that is, I think, one of the things to watch in the German market is, does the illicit market proliferate not because of a price disparity, but because other more innovative products are not yet available through these pharmaceutical channels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, no, it's really interesting about the German market because they don't grow it and they don't sell it, right? Because it's sold through pharmacy channels. So, I just kind of wonder, like, what is the value proposition for German companies, other than, to your point, like they spend a lot on research to have like this public focus. And this was, some of the challenges we were having is like, it's just not profitable businesses because, basically they're trying to take a margin on importing and markup and then sell, but then they spend a lot on R&D. So, is there any kind of talk about the profitability or the health of these businesses, or like, are they still on the capital raising cycle? Like anything around that?
Totally. Yeah. What should I say here? I think there's still a lot of open questions to be answered, right, about the profitability of these different businesses. And yet, some of the domestic operators like showed a little leg, when it came to their recent financial performance and sort of were charting like basically the substantial growth in patient count over the past 13 months and how their financials, right, had grown over time. And so I'll share some of this just because it was shared at the conference, right? But Sanity Group, for example, right, which is a leading German player, noted that, about a year ago, they were generating about $2 million in revenue per month. Now they're at about $6 million in revenue per month. They anticipate being at about $8 million in revenue per month. To your question about profitability, Morgan, they were not profitable up until a few months ago. Now they have greater than a 20% margin, which they, anticipate will increase going forward. And look, I'm not really in a position to interrogate and investigate those financials, but there was a lot of confidence presented amongst these domestic players that the sort of regulatory environment allowed them to be profitable. That said, I think, Morgan, your question is well taken. There were a number of, I would say, successful non-German operators at the conference that have done great things in their own country. And I think it's still an open question how that model might translate to a very difficult or a very different regulatory regime, right? So there was one panel that I was watching where Margaret Brody, the CEO of Rubicon Organics, was on the panel, and Raj Grover, the CEO of High Tide, were on the panel. And these are both two Canadian darlings, right? I mean, these are both two companies that have a very clear value proposition in Canada, right? High Tide, in a highly competitive retail environment in Canada, is able to make money, right? Rubicon Organics, right, is able to stand out with very high quality products. And so these are very impressive companies, very impressive CEOs. And yet, I think they would admit to you, they are still thinking through how they might fit into the German regulatory environment, right? Unless there's some secret plan, right? High Tide cannot replicate exactly what it's doing, right, in Canada, in Germany. And so I think, there's a tremendous amount of excitement about the market. And if you want, we can talk about patient growth numbers in a second, which are really quite impressive. But there still are open questions about what kind of enterprises can actually be successful in this kind of regime, to your point.
Yeah, why don't you hit us with those patient growth numbers, Hirsh? Then I want to talk about U.S. MSO presence in Germany. But why don't you talk about the growth of patient numbers? I think that's interesting data.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the most exciting things, the growth in patient numbers. And so I think most people listening to this know that, on April 1st of 2024, so I guess that was exactly 13 months ago, that's when Germany formally reclassified, took it off the narcotics list, right? And the practical effect of that is that it made it a lot easier to prescribe cannabis. You didn't have to go through this really intense process to do so. And so in April of 24, there were an estimated 250,000 patients, right, in Germany's medical cannabis system. As of today, there's estimated to be between 700 and 900,000 medical cannabis patients. And the reason I say estimated to be between 700 and 900, one of the things that I learned is that there's not really a clear mechanism by which Germany can at a given moment identify the specific number of patients, just because some of them are self-payers. So it will be an estimate by definition. But regardless, like in that range, the number of patients has at least, or has tripled over that period of time. And the estimates that I were hearing is that by the end of the year, people anticipate that there could be 1.5 million medical cannabis patients in Germany, because there's no sign that these prescriptions are slowing down. And that's really, this is a country of 80 million people. And to go from a nascent medical market to having almost 2% of the population be a medical cannabis patient by the end of this year is really astounding. I mean, I heard other estimates that people anticipate that, within, a couple, 2 to 3 years, that number could be 3 or 4 million patients. So the patient is really remarkable. I'll also say anecdotally, I talked to a bunch of people and I wanted to understand how difficult it was to become a patient. And they were like, dude, it's super easy to become a patient. Like, I just went online, right? I mean, it's much easier than it is in many states in the US, right? Where in California, to get the right kind of card, you have to go into the county office, right? During hours. Here, within half an hour, people could become medical patients, and they're describing it as an incredibly seamless process. And so I think that lends credibility to the idea that patients, that patient growth will continue to increase. And I'll say, I think that's what kind of animated the constant refrain I heard, where people were like, hey, Americans, we just want you to know, like, we don't care about adult use, right? Like, we're not even so much fixated on that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. They're like, oh, you're really focused on when does this market turn adult use? The time is now, right? Like, the growth is occurring now. Now, some of those comments are a little bit self-serving. I imagine if the current coalition government was an adult use program, many people would jump at it. But I thought it was striking how much there was a focus on embedding this cannabis system into the existing healthcare systems of the European Union, within the existing distribution networks, and to embed the kind of ethos that the government subsidizes, right, or helps in, and to sort of bring cannabis into that fold, right, which is a little different, obviously, than what's going on in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, with it that easy to get a card, it's pseudo adult use legal anyway. I mean, unless there's like high qualifying conditions, but if there's not, and it's easy to do it, and it's not a high barrier, you would expect the patient numbers to be healthy like that. To your point, because it's other just looking at some of our states. To your point, like California, there's really no reason to get a medical card. There's no benefit, and there's too much barrier to get it. So.
And a contrarian would say, Morgan, to what you said about patient numbers continuing to grow, a contrarian would say, hey, we have this new coalition government. The coalition government knows that it can't scrap the system entirely, but maybe what they try to do is they try to make telemedicine a little bit more difficult, for example. So yeah, there are counter arguments here about what might slow patient growth. But based on what I've heard, I believe you'll continue to see that growth going forward.
When I think about the MSOs, Hirsch, the name that stands out to me when I hear Germany is I think about Curaleaf, because they have a majority stake in 420 Pharma, which you mentioned earlier. They're a German producer, distributor of cannabis. And my understanding, and I'm far from an expert on Germany, is that they're one of the largest operators in Germany with a market share of around 10%. So Curaleaf has made that bet there. We've heard them consistently talk about it. Did you see Curaleaf at the event, Hirsch? And did you see any other MSOs that look like they might be either getting interested in Germany or dipping their toe in that water soon?
Yeah, I did not see Curaleaf at the event, which I thought was a little surprising. 420 Pharma did have a big presence, at the event. The one time I heard Curaleaf's name was during the panel with 420 Pharma, where the CEO, Torsten Grief, I believe is his name, mentioned their kind of like partnership with Curaleaf and how Curaleaf owns a majority stake. But I don't hear Curaleaf's name much, even though their partner, 420 Pharma, was kind of, in the stew there. And yeah, as you said, they seem to be one of the leading players, right, in Germany. So Curaleaf certainly has a foothold, even if Curaleaf wasn't present at the conference. The one other MSO that I saw at the conference, and I thought that was really interesting, was Cresco, right? So the keynote speech was given by Charlie Bechtel of Cresco, and that was interesting to me because I at least had never heard Cresco express kind of any interest about Germany. And so it was notable to me. First, Charlie kind of gave the keynote, right, like the opening keynote. And when I was looking at who was there from Cresco, to be clear, I don't speak for any of these companies. These are just my kind of observations, right? But I saw, Charlie from Cresco there. I also saw Greg Butler, right, the president of Cresco there. And I saw JP, who I believe is on the corporate development or on the IR team. And so first, I thought it was notable that they were there. that they were giving the keynote, and that they brought from some pretty significant firepower to be present at the conference. And I didn't see any other MSOs there, so Cresco was there. And I found Charlie's keynote interesting. Like the thesis or the title of his speech was, why is a U.S. operator in Germany, right? Like even asking the question, like, why is a U.S. operator at cannabis conference? And the answer, at least to me, that he presented seemed to be twofold, right? So one, he kind of alluded to the fact that growth has slowed down in the United States. He was like, many markets in the United States are experiencing growth and regulatory headwinds. And so it's important for U.S. operators to, as he put it, down the field at other opportunities. So that seemed to be one of the reasons, like, I'm here because the U.S. is slowing down and a lot of stuff is happening across the world. And so I want to educate myself. And then the other argument that he presented, which, I'm still kind of thinking through, is he said, we have been through what you have been through before, right? He said, we have been, and so here he was sort of advertising to, a largely European audience, saying, hey, we're Cresco. We've been through the fire for a decade. We've encountered many of the same challenges that you have. And so maybe you can learn from us. Now, that's kind of an open question, right? Like whether the licensing structure of Germany lends itself to the kind of we've seen in the US. It might not work out in that exact same way. But that aside, it seemed to me to be, and then they were like, hey, come talk to us afterwards. Like, we have learned a lot. You should come talk to us. So not to speak for them, but I interpreted it to be, we are here to educate ourselves on the German market, to present ourselves to the German market as an experienced player, and like, come talk to us, and like, let's see how we might explore how we gain a foothold in this market, knowing that I don't think it's clear for any non-domestic operator how they might play. So that was kind of my read of their presence there.
You make you think of Cresco being there, Morgan? Had you heard of interest on that side?
No, that's news to me. I heard some of our other MSO colleagues, I'll keep nameless if they didn't want to be disclosed of being over there, but we do know of others that were there and, doing some homework. So, but very interesting.
Well, anything else on the German side to dig into, Morgan, before we transition? I feel like we could do a full hour here, but we're about a half hour in. So anything else you want to dive into before we transition to the U.S. market?
No, I'm good to, I agree. I have many more questions, but I think we can move back to stateside.
Yeah, let's revisit that in a few months with Hirsh. I think that's a good market I'd like to learn more about. But let's talk about the other side of the pond where we are here, Hirsh, which, broadly speaking, maybe not quite as exciting as what's going on in Germany. I think it was 1984, and you might be a little young for this, Hirsh, but do you remember the Where's the Beef lady?
I don't.
Oh my gosh.
So I don't know if that changes.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. You said you didn't live here?
No, I said I'm a vegetarian too, so I don't know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I think it was 1984 or so. There was a Wendy's commercial where the old lady saw a competing burger and said, "Where's the beef?" And everyone thought the old lady was super funny. If you Google it, you can check it out. To guys like Morgan, who have a couple more years on you, that'll make sense. Anybody my age or older will totally understand what I'm saying. But I bring up the "Where's the beef" lady because I think in the U.S., we're asking the question, where's the growth? And that was really the theme for today's show. We talked about where the growth opportunities are in Europe, specifically Germany. But let's turn our eye to the U.S., Hirsh. And I think one market that has been really difficult to get when it first launched, tons of illicit activity, but finally is starting to improve is New York. Do you want to walk us through what's changed there and how you're viewing that market these days?
Totally. And I'll just say at a high level, I think there are maybe 4 growth markets in the US, New York, which we'll dive into right now. And then I think there are some minor ones which we can cover or not. And those are New Jersey, Ohio, and Delaware that are still growth markets worth noting, but not New York size. I will note quickly, all 4 of those markets border Pennsylvania, right? The 4 growth markets in US cannabis right now surround Pennsylvania, which is something we can talk about. But yeah, I mean, I think New York is the 2025 growth engine in U.S. cannabis. This past March, New York generated almost $140 million in sales, which was an all-time record. If you just do some quick math, right, for March, that's almost that's a $1.6 billion run rate. Just to think growth has occurred there. In the first quarter of 2024, right, so about a year back, New York was averaging about $35 million a month in sales, right? Whereas in March of 2025, it got up to 140. And so the market has grown 4 times, right? In over the course of a year. So I know we've been down on New York for a reason, but there's no way to deny that the growth there has been substantial over the course of the past year. And then the question is like, okay, what is driving that growth? And here, like, it's not rocket science. It's quite simple. And in January of 2024, when that year started, there were about 50 dispensaries open in New York City, or in New York, excuse me. Today, there are 370 dispensaries open in New York. So you've just seen a massive explosion of retail access across New York. And it turns out, again, none of this is rocket science. If you allow New Yorkers convenient access to legal cannabis, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them will purchase cannabis legally. That's kind of what you do in New York, particularly in New York City. You just kind of on that urban jungle and walk into stores, right? And it's quite convenient. And so the growth in New York has been explosive. I think there are really no signs of it slowing down. As I noted, there are 370 dispensaries open today. The OCM anticipates that by the end of the year, there should be around 600 dispensaries. So I think it will continue. I'll note that a lot of these dispensaries are opening in areas, I mean, I guess intuitively without retail access, right? Anyone who knows New York, when I read about these new stores opening, I'll read, oh, the first store in Greenpoint, Brooklyn just opened up. The first store in Flatbush just opened up, right? And if you know those areas, you're like, wow, this is the first dispensary in Greenpoint, the first dispensary in Flatbush. No matter the operator's prowess, they're going to, likely generate a decent amount of revenue given the lack of competition. So I think that not only are they new stores, a lot of them, unlike some other jurisdictions like New Jersey, where you're seeing a lot of stores crowd into like a small number of cities, New York, the retail growth is more distributed. And I'll also note, before I came to Germany, I stopped in New York because it's kind of on the way from California, obviously. And so I got to spend a week on the ground in New York, which was incredibly educational, especially during 420 week, where I got a sense of that same enthusiasm, right, that I was talking about before that we feel a little bit in Germany. And just walking around the East Village and the Lower East Side, like I saw a lot of closed illegal dispensaries, which was very different than the experience that I had coming to New York in 2022 and in 2023. And that kind of matched a lot of what I was reading about a number of those dispensaries closing. And so, yeah, I mean, look, there's still challenges in the New York market, right? I think someone, who wanted to be a little bit more down on the market would point out, hey, there's still a huge inversion problem in New York. That's really problematic for legal operators. I agree with that. Other people, right, might note that growth is not distributed evenly, that there are some of those retail operators that even fairly early in the game are struggling. So, not to look this entirely through rose-colored glasses, there are challenges, but New York is growing. And, I think it's quite close to being a top 5 market in the United States, right? Which is wild if you think about it, because it almost used to not exist, right? So if you think about the top markets, obviously you got California at the top, which is just south of 5 billion. You got Michigan after that, which is just south of 3 billion. You got Florida after that, which tends to hover above 2 billion. And then you have Illinois and Massachusetts, right? Illinois is generally around 2 and Massachusetts is a little lower. But New York just passed Missouri, right, based on its March performance, and it's close to becoming a top 5 market in the United States. And I think on a run rate basis towards the end of the year, like it will do in monthly sales, I believe, if we're talking in November or December, than an Illinois or a Massachusetts, right? I think it will be a top 4 market, again, on a monthly run rate basis by the end of the year. And I think, that really gives you a sense of, it will be a real contender here, whereas, again, a year ago or so, it was just an afterthought.
Yeah, I think talking about the revenue numbers is important, going from about $1 billion to $1.5 billion this year, but also Hirsh doing so at healthy margins. We, Leaf Brands, decided to enter New York. We signed an LOI for a Type 1 processing license, which is the broadest license there that allows you to do the most types of extraction. And one of the reasons we like New York was the growing market, huge opportunity there, but also much healthier margins. A jar of live resin in California that goes for 15 or 20 bucks goes for 60 or 70 bucks in New York. So for operators out there, certainly very profitable. Of course, you have to expect that to come down. We built that into all of our assumptions, but for a year or two at least, we have really healthy pricing out there. And on the public operators, Hirsh, we're starting to see a few more MSO doors open, but still not a massive MSO market. My notes show about 35 MSO-owned doors, Curaleaf 6, GTI 5, Cresco, Cannabis, and a few others look like they have 4. And isn't part of that, Hirsh, because still the majority of those doors are medical because there's a massive conversion fee to adult use?
Totally. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Most of the, some of the MSOs have sort of transferred those stores over to become adult use stores. But, kind of as you noted, structure of the law requires, many of those stores to remain medical, right, for the foreseeable future, right? Like all of the 8 current medical stores an operator might have, they will not, at least based on the way the law is structured now, be able to convert all of them. And then secondly, as you noted, like the conversion fees are just insane, right? They're really just like criminal, and they're just not the best use of capital for a lot of these operators that, of course, have limited capital to begin with. And so, because of that, you're seeing a lot of those ROs or those MSOs place a greater emphasis on wholesale, right? Their way to play in this market is to serve the growing universe of adult use stores that are being opened by card applicants. Now, I'm sure they would love to open their own stores, some of which are in awesome locations, but that's just not really the best use of capital right now. But, you are seeing some operators, like when I was in New York, expectedly GTI, right, seems to be building a really strong presence in New York. Like, Rhythm seems to be one of the leading flower brands. I mean, there are more niche brands that are greater brands there. But yeah, I think MSOs are taking advantage of that. And I believe the OCM put out a report that said that 10% of adult use sales in New York right now, like, the products being sold on the shelves are from the ROs, and 19% of the flower being sold on a New York shelf is from an RO. And so that gives you a sense, right, of the amount that they are capturing there. But I think there's still so much room, right, for all of these actors to capture a greater share of that pie, right? I mean, we're at a $1.5 billion run rate today. There's no reason that this market should not be a $5 or $6 billion market, opinion, given New York's status as just the center of global commerce. So yeah, some people have made some headway there, but I think there's still so much more room for those operators.
My last comment on New York is to contrast with Germany. We talked about form factors over there and flower still being really popular. It's working the other way in New York. And I think it's working. I'd be curious if you guys agree or disagree, but I think across the US in most markets, especially the most innovative markets like, California and New York that tend to be trend leaders, you're seeing products that use concentrates continue to go up. That's another reason we decided to enter the market. We make concentrates. And in New York, concentrates are used in over 52% of products, which I think is the highest number that I've seen. So lots of adoption there of innovative form factors, and especially the vape market just kills it over there.
Totally. That's consistent with what I've seen anecdotally, and also just companies that I work with, like Level Pro Tabs, for example, which is like a very pharmaceutical type product. I know it's kind of a unique product, but they're just gangbusters in New York. And that's about the farthest from flower that, yeah.
Yeah. So New York's a great opportunity, Hirsh. Why don't you run us through a couple more of these muted growth stories, states that are doing pretty well, but maybe not the level of growth we're seeing in New York?
Totally. Yeah, I think the 3 that I would mention are Ohio, New Jersey, and Delaware, and I'll go through them, sort of quickly so we can get to other things. Of the 3, I think the one worth mentioning the most is Ohio. At first, I think it's important to remember that Ohio is really important politically, right? I think part of the reason it would be very good for Ohio to succeed is that there's a lot of, political representatives from Ohio that could be useful to us as we try to advance federal policy. And so these are people like Dave Joyce, right? A name we know, but also the Senator of Ohio, Bernie Moreno. Folks may have seen that about a day ago. He officially was kind of designated the GOP Sherpa on cannabis, right? That used to be a guy by the name of Steve Daines, right? Who was from Montana, another healthy Republican state. But Bernie Moreno, who the first Republican candidate that I know of for the Senate to ever come out in favor of safe banking. Again, before he was even a senator, as a candidate, he came out in favor of safe banking. He's from Ohio, and so Ohio succeeding would be helpful for his advocacy efforts, and JD Vance as well. So that's just a quick political plug on why I think Ohio is important. In terms of growth, like I won't lie, Ohio has been a bit of a disappointment. Right? I don't think anyone can sort of deny that, right? Ohio is still a smaller market than Missouri, even though Missouri is half of its population, which really gives you a sense of like how it's underperforming. Ohio is still a smaller market than Pennsylvania, even though Ohio is adult use and Pennsylvania is medical, which is really insane if you think about it. So we shouldn't overlook the fact it has underperformed, right, relative to its size and its potential. But if you look under the hood a little bit, you are starting to see growth, right? So when adult use sales began back in August, on a weekly basis, you would see about $18 million in sales kind of per week, right? And that number has ticked up slowly, right, to about $21 million, despite the fact that prices have come down, 25, 30% in those 8 months. So not to suggest that Ohio is going gangbusters, but the fact that its sales continue to marginally increase despite the fact that prices are coming down kind of gives you a sense of the way in which unit growth is actually trending up there. And I know 420 week is an anomaly, but it had its like biggest week ever, right? In 420 week of like $23 million. I'm not saying that's sustainable every week, but that does show you the growth that's kind of happening. And I guess the reason I believe this will continue to be a growth market is twofold. One, new stores opening. We anticipated that 100 new dispensaries would open this year, right? That's what we were told by the regulator. Thus far, 4 months in, only about 20 have opened. I guess as in all things cannabis, we should always, sort of haircut anything that we expect. But you will see there are 80 stores in the pipeline, right, that are waiting to open. And I mention this because unlike a place like New Jersey, you see like 20 stores in Atlantic City and there's no marginal upside, right, to the next store opening in Jersey City or Atlantic City. In Ohio, like New York, I'm constantly reading about a county that just has its first adult use dispensary. And so that's why I think the retail growth is important. It can help drive sales. And the other thing, as I think people know, much to all of our frustration, we're still operating under the medical rules in Ohio. The law said that on September 6th of last year, we were supposed to be able to have pre-rolls. We were supposed to be able to buy full eighths. Here we are on May 1st. We still can't do that. The rule has been under review, right, by a legislative committee for several months now. So again, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture on a challenging situation, but I do believe, in the not too distant future, you're going to see more form factors open up. I know that, pre-rolls won't save the Ohio market, but they do account for about 15% of sales sometimes in market. So they do matter, right? And those higher concentrate products do matter. So the simple answer there is like, yeah, Ohio's not where it needs to be, but the retail, sort of penetration will probably double, right, over the next 18 months or so. It will continue to be a growth market. I think you'll continue to see that uptick in sales. And especially if those form factors get allowed, I think that's when you will really start to see that delta and, stop driving to Michigan so much as the prices come down a little bit, as more form factors are available, and as the store is more convenient to me.
Yeah, it's good to see the growth. I did see the headset data in 420 for Ohio, and it was good to see. It was one of the few markets that had a really nice 420 bump, and doing all of this in spite of, to your point, it's an interesting landscape because politically it's important, but at the same time they're really constraining growth with their, how they've held up the process to expand form factor, marketing. We hear this a lot from operators, is that nobody knows that we're an adult use legal store and we can't tell them because we get fined if we do. And then the other issue they have now is, guess what's being sold in gas stations is hemp pre-rolls, hemp with heavy quotes. So, they are behind the curve in some things. I understand, like, having some limitations as you're getting your feet around you, but at the same time, they got to also open their eyes and see that their lack of action on supporting the legal market is allowing for competition, and they're losing out as a result. So hopefully they get caught up on that. I do think there's a lot more, opportunity, just like we saw, like New York stumbled, as you were talking about before, New York stumbled horrifically out the gate, but now they're getting better about enforcement and getting access open, and they're rapidly growing as a result. It's kind of amazing how every state, we have to learn this over and over again, is that the two drivers of growth are access and enforcement. And, and California is still probably the poster child of, falling on both of those. And, we should be a $10 billion market here in California, but we're not. And so anyway, so it's interesting on the Ohio side of things, and it's a sleeper market that will just kind of keep ticking up. And to your point, when they finally get caught up, you could see even more there. So
can you guys imagine smoking gas station pre-rolls from Ohio? Like, pre-rolls can be one of the sketchiest form factors. My dad used to say it as a kid, Jesse, don't eat hot dogs. They're made with lips and assholes. And I think, is that too much, guys?
That's awesome.
And you think about pre-rolls, like there are great pre-rolls out there made from properly ground flour, but pre-rolls tend to be kind of made at the lips and the assholes of the, leftover, the cannabis bags. Now take that, and there is good hemp flour out there, good THCA flour, but that's not generally the best. Then you throw in the gas station component. I think I quit smoking weed, man, before I dipped into one of those.
Totally. I mean, I agree with that. First, I don't know if you guys have seen The Simpsons, where they show where hot dogs come from, but that's a really
Okay,
good.
I'll have to look that one up.
I think,
You look up where's the beef. I'll look that one up.
totally. The other thing I'll note is the Ohio Senate just passed a bill yesterday that would require intoxicating hemp products to be sold only in dispensaries. Now, that's just the Senate. The House would also have to act. But I do think that, a lot of us were concerned that the Republican legislature in Ohio might sort of overturn the ballot initiative. And they're certainly not friendly to cannabis. But I think one of the good things is a lot of their firepower in the legislative session, a good amount of it has properly been trained on the intoxicating hemp market as opposed to the regulated, cannabis market. So that gives me a little bit of hope that we might be able to move forward there.
I was just going to show
Go ahead, sorry.
CBX. I don't know if you guys have tried these guys. I just picked some of this up recently. Solid pre-rolls.
Oh, is that catabiotics?
Yeah.
It's cannabiotics.
Yeah, I had a fire jar of GMO from them a while ago. They grow some great stuff.
Yeah.
You want to hit us quick, Hirsch, with Delaware and New Jersey?
Yeah, I'll be quick here. Delaware, I know it's a state that people don't really care much about, right? It's a small state, but it's the next state that could start adult use sales. And there's only 13 dispensaries in Delaware. I know it's a small state, right? But when those stores are able to start adult use, they'll do quite well. There are some MSOs that have a presence there. I believe MariMed has a couple of stores in Delaware. The Cannabis has 3 stores in Delaware. And so if you listen to those folks, right, if you listen to like Jesse Channon from the Cannabis, he'll talk about how excited he is about Delaware, or John Levine will say the same thing for MariMed. So I think that's encouraging. And the other quick thing I'll say about Delaware is that Josh Sanderlin, their new regulator, again, this is getting is the exact kind of regulator that the cannabis industry should want, right? Traditionally, we've dealt with regulators that, in my opinion, are deeply hostile to cannabis, but now you have a new regulator installed in the state that has historically been a cannabis advocate, speaks like with passion and intellect about rescheduling. And so, small thing, but I think it's incorrect. They may finally get, it's been 2 years since they passed their adult use law, so I don't want to obscure how delayed it's been, but it seems likely that sometime this summer we could finally start adult use sales, which will benefit some of these operators. So that is a growth state, even if a small one. And New Jersey is kind of a mixed bag, right? For many, New Jersey is not a growth state because they were some of the initial operators to establish a retail presence in the state. And because New Jersey, because 70% of cities almost still ban cannabis businesses, the retail growth we've seen in New Jersey is, with some exceptions, increasingly concentrated in a small number of cities. So for a lot of people, New Jersey is not a growth state because their retail assets are not nearly as productive as they used to be. But for a number of really good brands, right, whether we're talking about a Garden Greens or a Clade 9 or a Grown Rogue, I realize only one of those is a public operator. The growing retail footprint and, brands that have cut their teeth in really tough markets like Oregon or California, right? They have the opportunity to do really well in New Jersey, right, given the price environment as retail growth continues there. And I'll just note that this past quarter will be the first quarter where New Jersey will have exceeded $300 million in sales, putting it at about like a $1.2 billion run rate. And so the growth has been slow, but this should be a $1 billion market if you just look at its demographics, right? Again, it's a much smaller state than Missouri, but it's still lagging Missouri. And so I think we're starting, even though there's a lot of pain for a lot of operators there, we are starting to see on the whole growth there. And I think that does present opportunity for brands, or, and this is the last thing I'll say, for those retail operators who can take advantage of like sort of that new provision that allows you to scale up to 10 stores, in part through JVs, right, with a lot of social equity applicants. So I'm sure they're not the only one, but I've heard Terrascend and Jason Wild, for example, talk about how that is their plan there, and I'm sure there's more to come.
Yeah, New Jersey, we've been very active in the state, and it seems like the state is, moving faster with getting more and more retail open, which is good. As we were just talking about, access is good. Just real quick on Delaware, please tell me someone has a Sleepy Joe indica offering.
They should.
It's a missed opportunity. Yeah. So we talked about all these states and surrounding this one particular state. What's going on in Pennsylvania?
Totally. Well, yeah, I don't need to tell you guys or anyone listening to this that Pennsylvania is the biggest potential catalyst Obviously, sentiment has been very tough for the past 6 months since the November election, right? Arguably, it's Pennsylvania passing could be something that reinvigorates sentiment to some extent. So I know we're all focused on it. Maybe we can talk about timing real quick, and then we can talk about like its prospects going forward. So just setting the table on timing, right? So we're here sitting in early May. I think the next thing everyone should be paying attention to is the House in Pennsylvania, right? That's the branch of the legislature that is controlled by Democrats, right? I think we can expect sometime in the next few weeks, certainly by the end of May, for the House to pass like its kind of legalization bill, and it'll get kicked over to the Senate to start a negotiations process, right? So the House, we know we can pass a bill there. There's already been a bill, bipartisan bill introduced there by a representative by the name of Emily Kincaid. That bill is going to pass sometime in the next few weeks. Then the hard part starts, right? Negotiating with the Republican-controlled Senate to get something signed. People may remember that Pennsylvania has a budget process, and this bill is being entertained as part of that budget process, right? And that budget has to be resolved by June 30th. And so basically, I think the next 2 months, a lot of the eyes on cannabis are going to be on Pennsylvania and whether this gets done or doesn't get done. And I think there'll be a lot of speculation, and we won't know kind of until the end. And just on implementation, right? The sort of bills as they're currently written, right? Say that, this bill will pass and the implementation date would be January 1st, 2026. So as we think about timing, that seems most likely. But I'll also note a lot of the MSOs that have been engaging with Governor Shapiro have been trying to impress upon him why it doesn't make sense to wait for sales, right? So I know Jason Wild, for example, from TerraSend has constantly been kind of communicating this to Governor Shapiro that, hey, you should start sales immediately. I mean, that would be awesome. I'll believe it when I see it. But that's sort of the timing. And then I think the question, right, we're here to answer is like, okay, well, is it going to happen or not? I can give you my reasons for why I think the setup here is meaningfully different than in any prior session. But before I do that, maybe I'll just play devil's advocate. We can kind of like run through the reasons why it won't pass, right? So if I were a skeptic, I would say history has taught us that whenever there's some sort of a regulatory catalyst, the good bet is that it will always fail, right? And that's not just superstition. It's that, the bureaucracy of the war on drugs is so embedded that the DEA can just kind of punt things, right? That the anti-cannabis sentiment is so deep that Ron DeSantis can just use taxpayer money to write stuff out an initiative, that a Supreme Court can violate established precedent and gut an initiative, right? We have seen time and time again how the infrastructure of the United States government is structured to create failure when it comes to cannabis reform. So it would be hard for me to argue with someone that says, hey, dude, like that's what's happened every other time. Why should this be different, right? And that person might also say, like, hey, like a lot of those GOP senators just said a few months ago that they're not willing to let this forward. Like, why do you think Shapiro is going to be able to broker a compromise here, right? Or they might say something like, hey, even if the bill passes, right, there will likely be huge conversion fees similar to New York that are included there. Or because Governor Shapiro wants to use this as a revenue generating mechanism, the tax rates are going to be so outrageous that it's going to be incredibly punitive. So that's all a way of saying those are fair arguments, right? And there's no response that I have that can completely undermine those concerns about why this might pass, right? But with that said, and again, this is another topic we could talk about for hours, but just to run through it quickly, why do I think the setup is meaningfully different than in prior years? Like kind of skeptical in prior years and less skeptical now. One, the election is over, right? It was going to be really difficult to broker a bipartisan compromise in the middle of the 2024 election. If you think about someone like Josh Shapiro, his incentive 10 months ago was to get Kamala Harris elected or to potentially be Kamala Harris's, VP nominee. Was his focus and that was his incentive. Now, right, his state just voted for Trump, right? He's running for re-election next year in a state that showed itself to be redder than he thought, than all of us thought it was, right? They just won, the Republicans Trump won Pennsylvania, obviously, but also a number of Republican, U.S. senators won, right? So now Josh Shapiro's incentives are different, right? He has an incentive to behave in a bipartisan fashion, kind of going forward. Secondly, the budget in Pennsylvania continues to crater, right? It's in a much worse position than it was 1 or 2 years ago, especially with a lot of funding from the federal government kind of being clawed back. So there's a huge kind of recognition that they need to generate revenue. And then finally, you have start to see little cracks in the GOP armor, right? You are starting to see more GOP senators, sort of express their openness to cannabis. And so, not to go too far down a rabbit hole when it comes to state politics, but there are senators like, Senator Yaw, right, of Pennsylvania, who was a skeptic before, but now is a Republican that has signaled that he might vote for legalization. There's Kim Ward, right, who's been a longtime prohibitionist in Pennsylvania, right, and who has kind of stopped a lot of these bills, but who recently said, well, I don't know if we should legalize it, but I don't think people should be arrested. And then she made some joke about how she met her husband, like through cannabis, which I thought was super weird for a prohibitionist to say, right? And so you're starting to see a little bit of cracks in the armor. And maybe, again, one thing I'll note is that the Democrats just won a special election in Pennsylvania for an open Senate seat about a month ago. So now there's one vote that they need to get. They took a Republican seat. So there used to be a 28-22 GOP advantage in the Pennsylvania Senate. Now it's 27-23, right? So I know these are all minor details, but these are the small things that can get us a little bit closer. And so I'll conclude here because, again, I don't want to go on for too long, but I think the things to be paying attention are the key GOP senators in Pennsylvania that might vote for this, right? So these are names for those, who want to nerd out on this. A name like Dan Laughlin, for example, right? A name like Gene Yaw, a name like Chris Gebhard, a name like Kamara Barotola, right? These are four like kind of moderate GOP senators that have made comments in recent months, be open to cannabis, right? If it was structured in the right way. That's going to determine more than anything Josh Shapiro says or what the Democrats say. That's going to determine whether this moves forward. And ultimately, it's about whether Josh Shapiro can give something to the Republican Party. This is all a negotiation game. Can he give something to them on some other cultural or economic that allows them to suspend their like semi-performative opposition to cannabis as they go through this budget negotiation? So I'll conclude by saying I thought there was a small chance that Pennsylvania might legalize cannabis in 23 or 24. Now I would say there's a better than 50% chance. I know that's not a super satisfying answer to anyone. Unfortunately, that's the best that I can do, but that's really what I genuinely think.
Just one last follow-up. So if it doesn't happen in June, and I appreciate the invert, always invert, huge fan of that. So appreciate running through that. But if it doesn't happen in June, realistically, what would be the next shot?
Yeah, there's basically two ways you can get each year, which is a good thing about Pennsylvania. You can get it done each year as part of the budget process, right, which is the one that wraps up in June, or you can go through the normal legislative session, right? So they could either include it in the budget, which is both a good thing because you're like, yeah, just stuff it in the budget, we'll make money. But the downside is like, hey, dude, we're not going to hold up this entire budget, right, and all of the funding for the state as we have this issue, right? So there's pros and cons there. And then you can pass it as a standalone bill. That session runs basically through the end of the year, basically through November. So I imagine if it doesn't pass through the budget, you will see, an effort to get it passed as a standalone bill, which again has its pros and its cons, but you'll have another shot on goal this year if it does not pass through the budget. But I really hope it passes through the budget because that could really give our space some of the momentum we need to really, even from a sentiment perspective, reinvigorate some desperately needed enthusiasm.
I can't believe you know who all those senators are, Hirsh, off the top of your head.
Impressive.
Very impressive. Yeah, and this one really moves the needle for public operators. There's about 135 MSO-owned doors in Pennsylvania. Truliev's the leader with 21. Curaleaf, Verano, and GTI all have 18. Jushi has 17, but with a really small market cap, and they have a big grow there as well. And Cresco has 15, and they're known for strong brands in the state and have a strong wholesale position as well. So big deal in terms of flipping the state, but also a big deal with the large amount of MSO exposure would really move the needle, especially on those tier one names and some of the smaller ones like your Jushis. So excited to keep an eye on that, Hirsh. Sounds like the prospects there are decent. We can call that cautiously optimistic. And why don't we switch tones a little bit and talk about Minnesota? Fascinating market for me. Not only did I grow up there, so I keep a close eye on it, but the interaction with the intoxicating hemp market, I think, is really going to be a case study someday. What I'm speaking to there is they have the low-dose edibles and the low-dose beverages available, in convenience stores, alcohol stores, grocery stores. You can even get some on tap at different breweries out there. So you have a lot of adoption on the hemp side. I'm curious, once the adult use program really rolls out, does that cannibalize that, or does that kind of serve as a leg into that adult use market? Meaning, do people say, I don't need the dispensary because I've already got my 5 milligram beverage, and so that cannibalizes sales? Or does it help and people say, oh, I love the 5 milligram beverage I have. Now let me step it up to a pre-roll or step it up to a vape card or buy some flour. So I think it's a really interesting market to watch from that perspective. But Hirsch, it sure has been frustrating at the rollout.
Totally.
By the way, Jesse loves beverage as a fun factor.
Yeah, it's my absolute favorite.
You got to pay him. You got to pay him to drink beverages.
Dollar a can.
Dollar a can. Yeah, no, first, what you said earlier, it will be fascinating to understand how the ground with that intoxicating hemp market will impact consumers, right? And whether the beverage TAM expansion thesis, proves to be true or not. So that'll be interesting to watch. That aside, I mean, Minnesota's been incredibly frustrating. I mean, I think there's no way to sugarcoat it. An incredible disappointment. It's funny. There's a Republican legislator in Minnesota, Nolan West, right? And I became aware of Nolan West 2 years ago, right? Some obscure Republican legislator after the Minnesota Democrats got their trifecta and they said, hey, we're going to legalize weed, right? Nolan West was the only Republican who was like, yeah, I'm down. We should legalize cannabis, right, in Minnesota. But let me be a part of this conversation because I think the system you're designing is destined disaster. I think it's going to end up in bureaucracy. It's going to end up in lawsuits. You guys are designing this like very elegant system that makes you think that you're masters of the universe. Can I join your meeting so we can talk about a more practical way to implement this? And so I just want to get a shirt that says Nolan West was right because he has been totally right. And every 3 months he writes an op-ed. I'm looking them up and he's like, hey guys, like, remember when I told you this was going to be a disaster? You really should have let me participate in this conversation. So shout out to Nolan West. Look, I mean, what can be said here? We're sitting here in May of 2025. We're about to hit the 2-year anniversary of when Tim Walz signed that bill. And at least to me, although I read various things, there's no clear line of sight to when adult use sales will begin. You have lottery processes that were designed in ways that, I mean, it's sort of an echo of New York, right? In ways that were not legally defensible, ultimately leading to lawsuits that kind of delayed the process. You saw a lot of rhetoric about equity and social justice when the was designed in a way that created delays that has bankrupted large numbers of entrepreneurs who sought to participate in this lottery. And so in the same way, you see this high-flying rhetoric from political elites, right, about social justice, whereas working class people are losing their life savings as a result. I thought we were past that, but we still continue to experience those catastrophic delays. Look, just to be real here, you've seen a total absence of leadership from Governor Walz, who signed this law to much fanfare, right? He spends more time talking about Tesla's stock price than trying to implement this program that he signed with this big press conference. And I think that's really shameful, quite frankly. And again, I'm just sharing my honest opinion. I speak for myself. A total absence of regulatory leadership in Minnesota. There's just been a rotating cast of regulators. I think the most recent guy, it's hard for me to even keep track, seems more reasonable, but I've been incredibly disappointed by the folks that were sitting in that seat and who would constantly deflect on these questions. You see a hostility to MSOs that just seems kind of silly, right? Creating a simple morality tale. Look, we all want a diverse and equitable market that allows economic prosperity to be shared broadly, but you see a lot of people using hostility to MSOs as kind of their platform for relevancy, not recognizing that there is not enough supply to serve that market. And so it's so disappointing that so late into this experiment, we are going through these same lessons again. And so that's really how I feel about it. Now, I mean, I believe the market, sorry, go ahead, Morgan.
I was going to say, yeah, to your point, I mean, is it true that I heard through water cooler chatter that, the hostility towards MSOs, they're not going to let GTI and Vireo have even a shot at adult use, right?
I mean, that's what I've heard. I mean, I've heard different things from some of those operators who contend that they're actually in conversation with the regulators that are going to lead to productive outcomes. But I've been hearing that for 6 months to a year, so I don't know how much faith to put in that. But yeah, I see echoes of what we saw in New York, where hey, maybe you can become adult use, but we're going to impose some ridiculous conversion fee that will make it kind of economical. And again, that's some of my same concern in Pennsylvania. Now, if you wanted to paint a rosier picture than I just painted, you could say, hey, look, man, right? Like Minnesota will have very robust access. Every city that has more than 12,500 residents will have to have at least one dispensary, right? So that means you will have 600, 700 dispensaries across the state. You can point to particular jurisdictions in Minnesota, like St. Paul, I believe, that has adopted a fairly kind of permissive framework. You can make the argument that even if Rio and GTI can't immediately convert their 10 stores to adult use, they could still build a really profitable business serving that universe of like 600, 700 licensees that might open up. You know, again, if you wanted to paint a positive picture, you could say, hey, the tax rate is relatively low and it borders for prohibition states, you know, being the Dakotas and like Minneapolis in Wisconsin, right? All of the reasons that I was quite excited for this market, right, when we were having this debate 2 years ago. But I, you know, I don't think there's any way to obscure the fact that this has been a terribly implemented program, and absent some real leadership and a course correction, things changing there in the near future. And I'll just say, I hope I'm wrong. I hope they turn on the spigot tomorrow and it becomes a great market, but I haven't seen signs of that just yet.
And Hirsh, the articles I read, it sounds like, in a couple conversations I've had with people in the state, it sounds like spring of 25 or 26 rather. I wish it was spring of 25. Spring of 26 is kind of the expectation now. Does that align with what you're hearing?
That does align. I mean, I read a recent article that said, hey, we could get this program up by the fall, right? And so my intuition tells me that spring of 26 seems most likely, just given how stalled so many of these license issuances have been. But I guess you continue to official mantra that this could happen later this year. And I'm reminded of when New York like continued to insist that sales would start in 2022, and then like one store opened on like December 31st, 2022. So you know, I guess it depends on what we mean by when the program starts, you know.
Well, Morgan, why don't you take us into Florida? That was a growth engine we were hoping to have sooner than later. Didn't work out last fall, but why don't you frame the situation for us there, and let's chat about it a little bit.
Yeah, so I think we're still licking our wounds from that not happening. And there's been some really interesting news coming out about, you know, Hirsh, you touched on this, about maybe some campaign money and some things that were maybe not done right. And even Roger Stone has been getting very vocal about what's going on in Florida, which is really interesting, you know, being all in the R camp. But, you know, just most recently this week, there was an initiative, what was it, born out of the Senate first in Florida, about trying to clean up the intoxicating hemp situation that's now dead again, it seems. So, you know, and where are, I guess, you know, just try to level set, where are we in Florida as a medical market? What's the process for, you know, it sounds like they may even raise the supermajority requirement for adult use. Like what's the prospects looking like in Florida?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, first on the hemp side, I think, you know, you guys know, and many people watching this know, that the hemp bill, you know, to regulate the intoxicating hemp market in Florida, which is just gangbusters, died yesterday. That was very suspicious to me, right? Like the reason is that they couldn't come to an agreement between like the House and the Senate language. It's interesting to me that a bill that passed unanimously last year, that all of a sudden there's so much kind of like disagreement and inability to find kind of like compromise on this issue that a lot of these people said was an issue. You know, the convenient thing about the fact that they couldn't come to an agreement is that doesn't put pressure on DeSantis. And if DeSantis were to veto the bill again, that would be really bad optics. Now he's spared from those bad optics. So I have no inside knowledge there, but it seems very suspicious to me that they couldn't find agreement there. The practical impact of that, regardless of why it happened, is that the intoxicating hemp market will remain an issue for the foreseeable future in Florida. Which is insane, given all of the rhetoric about children that kind of dominated a lot of the conversation, right, when it came to the adult use initiative. So I think that turn of events is really unfortunate. On DeSantis, I mean, I guess you can say it's encouraging that to some extent he's being held accountable. If I were a betting man, right, just given that he's a powerful, I think ultimately he escapes really deep punishment here. I mean, maybe at worst, his wife, who allegedly was a contender for the governor's nomination next year, maybe she has kind of a stain on her and her political prospects are damaged. And so, I mean, as an American citizen, it's encouraging to see the rule of law assert itself in some capacity. In our space, we operate in the space where, you know, all sorts of illegal behavior against cannabis is tolerated. So it's encouraging that there's at least a conversation, right, about his misdeeds that are happening there. I'm not sure whether or not he's held accountable. If you wanted to be an optimist, you could say, you know, something to this effect, right? You could say, hey, the fact that like his arguments against Amendment 3 are now seen in such a negative light will mean that those same arguments will not have resonance for a future ballot initiative, right? I mean, that's kind of an optimistic way of looking at it, but he kind of like stained the prohibitionist arguments, I believe, because there's a widespread understanding that what he did was not appropriate. So I think that's one thing to note. About future initiatives, as you know, Trulieve is currently sort of spearheading an effort to put it on the 2026 ballot. I think a basic comment that anyone would make is that these initiatives tend to have a tougher time in off-year cycles than they do in presidential years, because the cycle is one where the full electorate comes out. And as we all know, right, these cannabis initiatives have a much more successful track record during presidential years than they do during off years. That's not to say that there aren't off-year success stories like we saw in Missouri or like we saw in Maryland, but just the data shows you have some wind at your back when you're going into a presidential year. So that will kind of be one headwind. But that aside, you can say the prohibitionist arguments have been cast in a much more negative light. As you guys are aware, the current initiative that is circulating tries to make some attempt to address a lot of the arguments that, the criticisms that were made of the initiative before, right, around advertising to kids, which again is such a joke given the intoxicating hemp stuff that's going on, but around advertising to kids, right, or around home grow. And so the initiative is arguably being crafted in a sounder way. The arguments against it, might be looked at in a more critical light. Still, the politics are a little bit harder in 2026. And maybe the only other thing that I'll say is it'll be interesting to see how this lines up with the gubernatorial election, right? So DeSantis is termed out, right? 6 to 9 months from now, the Florida governor's race is really going to ramp up. Probably one of the leading contenders to be the next Florida governor is Byron Donalds, in part endorsed by Donald Trump, which is a big stamp of approval in Florida. And although he voted against Amendment 3, he said that he did it for constitutional reasons, and that he actually, he has intimated that he is more friendly to weed than DeSantis is. So I know that's not a clear answer, but I think those are kind of like just the competing considerations as we go forward. And maybe one other thing I'll say is, what the program needs is you need to sign up more medical patients, and none of these things will be a silver bullet. Bills like, making it easier for veterans, right, to access medical cannabis cards for free. I'm not going to pretend that that's going to save the Florida market or mitigate the ongoing price compression there. You got to get more patients into the system, and little bills like that can help, I think, on the margins.
Yeah, and we have seen patient growth reaccelerate. I think there was definitely a lot of people that were just not bothering because they thought it was going to pass. But now that's resuming, right?
Yep. I believe it's at 915,000, right, as of now, which is like 20,000 more than it was around the time of the election. So, and to your point, Morgan, like that growth was basically flat, right, throughout much of 2024. So yes, you have seen that resumption of growth for the exact reason that you mentioned.
So Encyclopedia Hirsch, what is the population size of Florida? Do you know?
23 now. 23 million.
23 million.
With 130 million tourists or something, like some crazy number, right, Hirsch?
Totally, yeah. A lot.
Yeah. I was just thinking about it in context to what you were saying about Germany. What was the size of Germany population?
82, I believe.
Okay.
82 million. So much bigger.
Okay.
But
Much
it is
bigger.
exciting, right? Like sometime this month, Germany will pass Florida, right? Probably when it comes to medical cannabis patients. And if that growth continues, I mean, just to wrap this all up, by the end of the year, if we're at 1.5 million, that's a Florida and a Pennsylvania put together, right? That's what Germany could be in terms of medical patients. So
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah. Anything else you want to touch on in Florida, Jesse? Or
No, I think I'm good, and I think we'd be kind of quicker on the next one, talking about mature markets that are, experiencing pain. We highlighted Michigan, Massachusetts, California, and Arizona as markets that are experiencing some pain. And guys, how I see this being impactful to portfolios is we kind of expect markets over time, they flip to adult use. There's a couple great years, and then it's a matter of how quickly do they compress. And so you see some ones like New Jersey that hang in pretty well, and then you see other examples like Massachusetts experience pretty severe compression. California's pretty difficult. And so the challenge, I think, to an investor's portfolio is if in a normal year, see if I can frame this properly, you have markets in your portfolio that are degrading. Let's say you own a diversified MSO portfolio. You have markets that are degrading. That's one thing. But this year you're missing the growth elements. So all you have is the grading. You don't have the new growth markets to offset, these legacy markets that have been going down. I think that creates, a lot of problems in the space. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing a lot of margin compression this year. So Hirsh, kind of talk to me if there's a way you can frame it broadly, just as we're chasing the clock a little bit here. Just kind of, can you frame broadly how you're seeing these legacy, mainly legacy markets, your Michigans, your Californias, and also Massachusetts and Arizona? How do you see that price compression moving at this point? Do you see it slowing? Do you feel like we're getting to a bottom in any cases, or some of those starting to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, just to be quick here, if I think about all those markets, you can put them in different buckets, right? And I think I would put Michigan and Massachusetts bucket. Now, what I mean by that is these are two markets that have continued, the mature markets, they have continued to actually increase sales, right, marginally for years. The market overall, right, is growing and unit growth is growing substantially, but there's just really severe price compression. Now, what are the drivers of that price compression? I think there's two things. One is licensing structure, and two was maturing during COVID, is what I would say, right? So Massachusetts and Michigan just have licensing structures that really place no limits on supply, right? Like the licensing structure, right, unlike many other states, are such that supply is basically unlimited. And so that licensing structure, in concert with the fact that those markets matured during 2020 and 2020, when cannabis was deemed an essential business, when there was far more capital availability in the space, meant that like much more of that supply was kind of built out. And so I guess what I'll say is what maybe most people on the call know. It's a great market for consumers, right? But it's a really hard market to make any money in. People say for low prices is low prices, which, and I take that, that's a fair point. But at least in Michigan, we haven't seen that be the case. Prices continue to go down there, right, without any evidence of rebounding, despite the fact that operators continue to leave the market. And so, yeah, that's a really tough market in which to be an operator. I don't think there's any way to obscure that. Maybe you have a really talented operator like Harrison that is able to build some level of scale in a Michigan to mitigate their losses there, but it's still a really, really tough market. And I'll also say, just with Massachusetts, one of the things that kind of frustrates me, you see all of these businesses dying, right? And you see some operators that are trying to sell their assets because they want out. They put their entire life savings into this business. And then you have people who claim to be standing up for equity and saying, hey, we cannot, lift the 3-store cap, right? Because that will lead to a monopolized market, which, you see academics or other people working for nonprofits making these claims, whereas the people who put their lives into this business are not able to exit it to satisfy some theoretical, but in practice, not justifiable claim about equity. So, anyways, that's Mass in Michigan. I'll just say quickly about some of the other markets that you mentioned. I think California is a little different in that Mass and Michigan, like on a per capita sales basis, they're actually doing pretty good, and their sales have continued to trend up. I don't think you can make that claim about California, which in my opinion is the most mismanaged of all the US markets. We have seen over the past 4 years a 20% price decline. Now, there are some really good operators, right, in the state that are able to compete on price. Glass House being a good example, or there are some good retailers like an Embark that have total locations and that can succeed. But the market is totally cratering. And you know this well, Jesse, out of the 1,200 dispensaries in California, only 200 of them, in my opinion, can be counted on to consistently pay their bills. And that shows you it's not just the survival of the fittest, kind of ethos. Like this is an ecosystem. And if you destroy the ecosystem, that will spread throughout. So that's the unfortunate reality of California. And then, Arizona, I would say, it's experienced some challenges, but I would put it in a little bit of a different bucket than the other ones, right? This is a market that used to be a really good market that's now just an average market, right? It suffers from this price compression because, again, there's not limits, right? But there are limits on dispensaries, which mean, there's only about 170 retailers in the state. And so they retain their power, right? So those dispensaries still do reasonably well, but price compression is happening. The intoxicating hemp market is happening. And so what used to be like a cash cow for, a True Leaf, right, or a Verano, I think can no longer be described as a cash cow. So,
yeah, that's helpful context. Appreciate it. You want to wrap us up, Morgan, talking about things on the federal side? Then we'll hit them with the grok and get out of here.
Sure. So some chatter. It seems like every year around 420 picks up in DC. Making some positive claims. We had Terrence Cole being, the most recent comments, right, talking about looking at the science and where is the DEA in the process, and some talk. Well, we had States 2.0 get out there. To me, it's words, want actions, but and obviously we got Farm Bill in the mindset as well. Even though it seems like even states are struggling with how they want to handle this, and there seems like there's much more formidable pushback on trying to do anything. And I get, to your point, all the hypocritical comments as a result of all of this, but still pretty messy. But what's kind of your lay of the land of the federal landscape?
Yeah, I mean, Morgan, I think you said it well, right? This is a show. I mean, people have said this is a show me story, not a tell me story now, right? So, like, yes, it is. I did find it encouraging that that Terry Cole said that rescheduling will be one of his top priorities. I know there's other ways to read his comments as being skeptical, but I, on balance, view those as encouraging kind of comments, right? Because we've been stuck. 5 months from now, it'll be the 3-year anniversary. Scheduling was first announced in October of 2022. We've been stuck in this bureaucratic morass. So that is encouraging, but I'll believe it when I see it. You probably have read the same reports I have that unnamed Senate Republican staffers have said there's a 90% chance that safe banking will pass this year. That's a very bold claim. I hope they're right. It's really hard for me to assess that. So I hope they're right. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think that's kind of where we are. You are seeing some comments that are encouraging. You can make the claim that, like, with someone like Bernie Moreno spearheading this process coming from an adult, a red adult use state, that could lead to some progress. But I think all of us are speculating until we see what happens here. So that's my short, probably not super insightful answer, but we're just playing a waiting game.
Yeah. I mean, Congress, have they done anything yet this year? So until they actually get back to work, it's hard for me, but Jesse knows that. I'm long time been struggled with words over actions and from them, but we'll see. Anything you want to touch on from the Farm Bill?
The Farm Bill, what I would say is, I think one of my concerns about the Farm Bill is I could see, in the same way we saw in Florida, consensus that something needs to be done, but an inability to agree on the specifics, right, of how you solve the problem. I could imagine something similar happening with the Farm Bill. And so, again, we'll play a waiting game, but I think there's a lot of steps between now and getting to some consensus about how that Farm Bill is kind of restructured. I have more faith in our recent court decisions that sort of give more power to states to regulate their programs. And so that's the way in which I see this unfolding. In other words, there was a recent Fourth Circuit appellate court decision from a few months back that clarified that states have the ability to impose, more restrictions on these intoxicating hemp products than are prescribed by the Farm Bill. Now, that's something that many of us believe to be true, but having an appellate court kind of move that forward is very helpful. Again, the downstream of that, you need the states to be actually able to come to some agreement. As we've just seen in Florida, that's not always. So I guess I would say, getting to some consensus from the federal government will continue to be a challenge. I'll believe it when I see it. And I think more of that activity will continue to happen on the state level.
Hirsh, can they just keep kicking the can on the Farm Bill indefinitely without actually, drafting a new one? Or what are the rules about how many times they can extend it?
I mean, the rules are that, excuse me, that you have to pass a Farm Bill every 5 years, right? So I guess in theory they could continue to extend it, and there's nothing stopping them from doing so. I mean, it's now been 7, I believe, so it's got to be addressed at one point or another. But I think in theory it can just keep getting kicked.
So there's a rule, but they don't have to follow it. Is that what you're saying?
That's a welcome to American government.
Shocking, right? Yeah. Rules for thee, not for me. Something like that, right?
Yeah,
That's right.
Anything else on the federal side before we wrap up and talk about grok?
The last quick comment I'll make is that comments like the one that Tom Tillis made at the hearing yesterday, I think, are very encouraging, right? So this didn't get as much attention as what Terry Cole said, but Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, continues to make a very articulate case for why the state-federal conflict is untenable and has led to, as we know, a wild, wild west. I know those comments by themselves don't lead to action, but I do think comments like that do hit at the heart of the issue. And the fact that someone who is coming from a state that has no cannabis program is willing to say that, I think is really encouraging.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's transition to Ask Grok, and before we get into your specific Grok, I will tell people that I've been trying to learn a lot more about AI over the past couple of months and integrate it more into workflows in my life, and stumbled across a great podcast I think I shared a week or two ago. The name escapes me right now, but that led me to looking into the guest in that podcast more, and he wrote a book called The AI-Driven Leader. And it talks about somebody in the consulting business and how they learned about AI and how they built this consulting business and how they're helping people use AI to really make more effective decisions. Less about how can this help me write an email, or less about how this can help me with a social media post, and more about effectively using AI for strategy and deeper dives. And I know you've been getting into that a little bit more beside Morgan, but if anyone's looking to up their AI game, check out that book called The AI-Driven Leader. I'm about halfway through, and gives you some basic things like good prompts to use, but also just gives you a ton of ideas about how you can use AI to go way beyond things like writing emails. So again, if you're interested in that, check out The AI-Driven Leader.
Well, and I think Higher Exchanges is quite a AI driven or AI mindful, since we've had this Ask Grok segment now for quite a while.
Yeah.
So this week's Grok, I asked, given Terrence Cole's comments yesterday, so about the rescheduling process, I said, what is a probabilistic timeline for rescheduling? Grok gave me this very thorough response, but I'm just going to read the summary because it was very thoughtful. I was very pleased with that. But so Grok's answer: most likely timeline, assuming Cole is confirmed and acts on his stated priority, points to a final rule effective by May 2026. So that's the baseline scenario. That's a 50% probability. An optimistic timeline could see completion by February 2026, but only a 30% probability, while a pessimistic scenario pushes it to October 2026 or later with a 20% probability. These estimates hinge on Cole's confirmation by mid-2025, resolution of hearings by mid-2025, and a decision by late 2025. However, his cautious approach, DEA's history of delays, and potential legal challenges introduce significant uncertainty, making a prolonged process more likely than a swift resolution.
Yeah, I didn't hear 2025 in there as much as I would have liked to, Morgan.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that one, Hirsh, in terms of when we finally see resolution on Schedule 3?
I think 2026 seems more realistic just because the confirmation to happen, and presumably if he says he needs to study what's in front of him, that will take some time. But I hope I'm wrong. One day we'll wake up happy. But, yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation, guys. The reason we started doing Higher Exchanges is we wanted to have conversations we'd like to have anyway, but do them in a public format. And it's just been awesome to talk to you, Hirsh, for about an hour and a half here and learn so much about Germany, which was great, but also get these updates on the U.S. So thank you again for joining us live from Germany. If people want to follow you or even learn more about your consulting business, Hirsh, where's the best place to get hold of you?
You can follow me on Twitter at Ananda Strategy. That's ANANDA Strategy. Or you can go to my website, www.anandastrategy.com. And thanks for having me, guys. I love joining you. So thank you.
Yeah, it's great having you back on.
Yeah, super good conversation. So thanks again, Hirsh. Thank you, Morgan, as always. Appreciate everyone listening and watching on YouTube. And we'll talk to you again soon. The views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only. Nothing we say should be considered research or recommendation. All investing involves risk, including the loss of principal.